On behalf of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, 3CT, I'm the director, Lisa Wadeen, and it's an honor to welcome you to this evening's event on university values, part of our conversations in a new series entitled The Corporate University. This is a project that began this year with the acknowledgement that higher education is in crisis. From budget deficits to the reliance on adjunct labor, from anxieties about so-called woke campus politics to worries about cancel culture, from the erosion of faculty governance to the empowerment of consultants and trustees, the university as an institution is being transformed. This project seeks to make sense of these battles and changes while outlining prospects for a salutary collective future. The crisis of higher education was laid bare and exacerbated by the recent testimony before Congress of Columbia University President Shafiq. As Louis Manon in The New Yorker put it, quote, "It was shocking to hear her negotiating with a member of Congress over disciplining two members of her own faculty by name for things they had written or said," unquote. As we know, and as Manon continued, quote, "The next day, in what appeared to be a signal to Congress, Shafiq had more than 100 students, many from Barnard, arrested by New York City police and booked for trespassing on their own campus," unquote. And as both Manon and Nadia Abulhaj pointed out, the latter in an interview with the New York Review of Books, Columbia made the students' presence illegal by summarily suspending the protesters first. These actions are symptomatic of a growing, or one might say a renewed, rift between administrations on the one hand and faculty and students on the other. These actions also raise questions of central importance to tonight's focus. For at our last event, which centered on the Kalven Report, Cathy Cohen called for the creation of a document that delineates our values. Some participants and audience members noted that the Kalven Report and the subsequent Chicago Principles Statement of 2014 valorize freedom of inquiry and expression, but fail to recognize that some have more power and thus freedom to speak than others. Moreover, commitments to free speech and to institutional neutrality are not sufficient to maintain a space in which all students and faculty enjoy a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation. Should the values of academic freedom be ones we all work hard to cultivate and safeguard? Why do they seem so imperiled in the present, so vulnerable to, say, donor pressure, politicians' caprices, and the euphemisms of corporate speech? These questions beckoned us at the Kalven conference or gathering. These questions beckoned us to begin a serious conversation that also took into consideration related questions, such as, in the face of what are arguably a cluster of unprecedented challenges to higher education, what kind of practices and atmospheres should we as a community be cultivating to protect free inquiry and minimize harm? Can the classroom or the university environment be both safe and uncomfortable as part of the process of learning? And if so, how? Are diversity and equity as essential as free speech in the production of knowledge? Why or why not? How might these goals be compatible and how might they be in tension? What kinds of commitments should we be affirming and struggling to enact? And what forms of governance and infrastructure would serve such efforts? Before getting started, I want to thank 3CT's Associate Director, Anna Searle Jones, for her help in organizing this gathering and for everything she does to make 3CT a space where these conversations are encouraged. We at 3CT are also grateful to Ryan Eckholt and to our two student assistants, Heather Welty and Delaney Wallace. I'm now going to turn over the event to my beloved colleague, Cathy Cohen, the David and Mary Winton Green Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, who is also the chair of the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, and a fellow of 3CT. Please join me in welcoming her to introduce everyone.
All right, good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well on this absolutely gorgeous day, and thank you for joining us. I have the role of moderator, which means you will hopefully hear very little from me, and we will keep things moving. And I'm delighted, and I don't really use the word delighted often, but I am delighted to be joined by three outstanding and really wonderful colleagues who will engage us in a discussion in thinking about this question of values and what, in fact, a university should value. So let me introduce my colleagues. Then they will each take up to 10 minutes to provide some opening comments. I will then pose a question. Lisa will pose a question. If there's time, we might have a little back and forth, and then, of course, open it up to the audience. I guess that's what you are. Okay. So Anton Ford, who is in the middle here, is an associate professor in philosophy. His primary research and teaching interests are in practical philosophy, understood broadly to include action theory, ethics, and political philosophy. Figures of special interest include Aristotle and Marx. Gabrielle Lear, to my left, is professor of philosophy and chair of the Committee on Social Thought. She specializes in ancient Greek and Roman ethics and aesthetics. In several articles, her work has explored the Greek idea that virtue is beautiful and the various roles this idea plays in theories of moral education, practical reasoning, friendship, and happiness. She has also written about Plato's poetic theory and about Aristotle's theory of happiness. And last but certainly not least, all the way in at the end, is Gina E. Miranda Samuels, who is a professor at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, and faculty director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Her scholarly interests include transracial adoption, mixed race and multi-ethnic identity formation, critical and interpretive research methods, and the development of relational, kinship, and cultural ties among young adults whose childhoods are shaped by displacements caused by foster care, adoption, and home loss. All right, so these colleagues will start us off. I'm going to start with Gabrielle. You have 10 minutes.
Okay. So can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I just want to say, Cathy and Lisa, thank you so much for sort of having the idea of this whole series. This has really been one of the highlights of my year coming to these events. I feel really honored to have been asked to say something here, so I will do my best. So I thought, studying philosophy, especially ancient Greek philosophy, I like to start with first principles. That's where I feel comfy. And so the motto of the university, Crescat Scientia Vita Exploratur, let knowledge grow from more to more, and so be human life enriched. Florida translation. So the first thing I want to say is that this vision of what a university is and what it's for predates our current moment, the university at this current moment. In fact, it's a vision that predates the founding of this university, but it certainly predates sort of this current kind of corporate university formation. And in my view, the sort of corporatization of the university has sort of distorted our understanding of what this goal and motto means, and makes it hard for we ourselves, even we who think that there's something wrong, it can make it hard for us to understand. I mean, is it there's sort of the obvious things to think that knowledge is not an industrial product, and so I would also say we are not laborers who are paid in exchange for producing knowledge, and nor should we be thought of as capital to be invested in. So that way of thinking about what we are, I feel like is a distortion which we ourselves sometimes tend to fall into thinking that way. So what is my understanding of what sort of this motto means? What is knowledge? So the first thing I want to say is it's an activity. Knowledge is something that we do. It's not a product. It's an activity of thinking knowledgeably. And so that means it's either knowing what's true or what there is good reason to believe or do, and knowing why. I think then that, we should, that the fact that sort of knowing what the university is here for is sort of distorted by this corporate way of thinking, or really maybe it's a kind of consequentialist concept of value that distorts our understanding of what we're doing, because our knowledge is not separable from our activity. And the value of our knowledge isn't determined by what consumers, that is either students or industry or governments, are willing to pay for it. And I really think that, this language, we were talking beforehand, I know that some of you remember that email we got from the Academic Communicators Network encouraging us to go to a webinar about how to improve our brand. I think this is really, it's sort of a joke, but it's a really pernicious way of thinking of ourselves as having a personal brand which we market on social media or whatever. So when I think about what this activity is, Socrates is always my model. And so for him, I think, obviously this activity of knowledge is the activity of an individual, because thinking is something that individuals do, but it's something that they can only do well in community with other people. So it requires, freedom of expression. I do think this is one of the absolute core values of a university. But what is that freedom of expression? I would say, following Socrates, in the first instance, it's the freedom to wonder. It's the freedom to have a question. And that means that, if you have a question that's genuine, we need to have a space in which that question can be asked, even if other people don't like the question and don't feel comfortable by the very fact that you're asking the question. And one wonderful model of this is, Socrates in the Phaedo. This is the death scene. He's trying to prove the immortality of the soul. He's about to be executed. And his friends, Simmias and Cebes, they start listening. They don't think his argument is very good. And they're afraid to ask that. They're afraid to tell him and criticize the argument. He says, come on, go ahead. I can take it, right? So, questioning is often uncomfortable. We worry about offending others, but we need to have the freedom to question when it's genuine. Another thing that Socrates thought then is about answering what is freedom of expression there. He thought of it as calling the individual that you're speaking to witness. That's what he said. You're calling the individual you're speaking to witness to the truth of what you're saying. And that's by contrast with trying to appeal to some cultural authority or to what the group of people think, but it's a real person that you have to be addressing in your conversation. And that means thinking about what is their perspective on the issue and trying to find premises for your argument or evidence for your argument that you think they themselves will accept, because you're trying really to speak to them. And the value of that isn't just in, that you will get the person to agree with you, but by trying to look at it from another perspective and to persuade, you're actually benefiting yourself, because you may find out that what you're saying isn't quite right. So we don't want to just appeal to authority or to try to bully people into thoughts and agreeing with us, but we want to call them to witness. And another beautiful phrase Socrates has is, the truth is my possession, he says, and you cannot try to exile me from that possession. And I don't think he means the way people now talk about speaking your truth. It's not that that you have sort of a special personal standpoint on the truth that others have to respect, but it's rather that it's my responsibility to decide for myself what I think reality really is. And the person speaking to me has to respect that when they're talking to me, and not just try to scare me and intimidate me. into agreement. So this idea of, what is a kind of knowledge-seeking activity is one that begins with real questions and tries to address real people. I think then, leads to that value of free expression in that sense. So then this is just something, last night I was talking to a visitor here who said he thinks that the reason, what people mean when they say the University of Chicago is a real university, what they mean is that this is a place where there's genuine debate and difference, genuine debate and genuine difference. And so that leads to the second value, which is diversity. And so obviously, this is diversity of origin and cultural, and it's important because of diversity of standpoint. But one thing I want to say here is, as Lisa mentioned, there's a question about power when it comes to diversity and who has the freedom to speak and share their perspective. And I would say that in the first instance, power is local, right? And there can be sort of the local consensus is powerful, even if that local consensus is not in step with the larger world. And I think we need to be attuned to that when we're thinking about differentials of power and how it affects freedom to speak. It's not just a problem, and I think it is a problem for people who are coming from disadvantaged standpoints in the wider culture, but we also need to realize that we have our local culture, and people who feel out of step with that culture, we need to take care for them. Then my final lesson from Socrates is that he was killed. Right? He was killed. It was close.
He had a chance.
He was killed. And I think that, although this is our sort of problem, is on the one hand, we need our community in order to learn anything and to engage in this activity of knowledge. But groups contain murderous tendencies that they're not always aware of. And so that's an ever-living tension that we both need the group, and the group can become a mob, and we just have to be alive to that. So that's now then my third value, which I think is just as important as freedom of expression, is intellectual friendship. That we need to think about how to foster a community that feels not just having a diversity of standpoints, but one in which people feel genuinely supported. So I can imagine now Cathy asking, what practical difference do these values actually make in what we do?
Maybe.
So I think just to throw out a few that we can think about, the language that we use. We should be attentive to our language and metaphors, as Lisa was saying. I think activities that build intellectual community, like this series, which I think is fantastic. We need more of this where we come together. It's also made me think a little bit and value the disciplines and the divisions, because those are intellectual formations that don't originate from a similarity of standpoint and intellectual interest. Whereas our workshops often do come that way, or that people share something that they're interested in and share an intellectual orientation, and so they start a workshop. Our disciplines and our departments and divisions are places where we do more often meet people from different perspectives, and sort of fostering the intellectual life and friendliness of those sort of sub-entities, I think is really important, and that's connected to faculty governance. There has to be a human state in those areas. And then the last thing I'll say, I can see Cathy trying to wind it up,
Yes.
is I think we should, it makes a difference on the thinking about the teacher's authority in the classroom. It is the teacher's job to rule out certain directions of inquiry. That's how you make progress, is not by following everything. And so this is a question about academic freedom, and then how that fits together with saying that a teacher who has made controversial statements can't teach courses that are required, and that the student can't get away from if they feel uncomfortable. My initial inclination is to think, no, academic freedom means you hire the person who let them teach, if that's what, whatever. But I see, in talking to people, I start to see the thought, well, maybe we do need to think about providing students alternatives, not so much to ideas, but to people that they fear, or for some reason feel afraid of. Okay, so I'll stop.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to approach the topic of university values by discussing the values professed by our own university. The University of Chicago occupies a unique place in the contemporary political imagination. It must be related to the fact that our president was not called in front of Congress like presidents of our peer institutions, who got in trouble for having lax speech codes when we're famous for loosening the speech code. Why are we not in trouble? There's something puzzling about the space that we occupy. Just last week, Bret Stephens, a columnist at the New York Times, an alum of this university and a right-wing ideologue, wrote that, quote, "If it were up to me, I'd sentence the protesters at Columbia University to 6 months of hard academic time at the University of Chicago." That's a strange thing to say. It implies that we, or at least our students, are under a special discipline, one which one doesn't find on just any campus. So what's up with that? I mean, why is our university the darling institution of right-wing ideologues and of governors and of senators on McCarthyite crusades against higher education? What is it that they love about this place? It clearly has something to do with the Chicago principles, but what? The Chicago principles identify the freedom of speech with the freedom of discussion. Discussion is not the only mode of rational public speaking. It differs from deliberation on the one hand and from protest on the other. Public discussion is truth-seeking speech. Public deliberation is decision-making speech. And public protest is disruptive speech. All three are fundamental democratic values. Only the first is sanctioned by the Chicago principles. In effect, the Chicago principles assert that the only legitimate kind of speech in a community of scholars is aimed at discovering the truth. All speech is then conceptualized as a more or less defective case of the mode of speaking appropriate to a classroom discussion. And this points to what I think is the most important expansion we could make to the prevailing conception of university values. We should affirm that in a community of scholars, deliberation and protest are fundamental forms of free expression. This is perfectly consistent with affirming that discussion, which is aimed at the discovery of truth, is the sine qua non of university life. The kind of thing we do in a seminar room, conversing, debating, arguing, disagreeing, exchanging ideas, inquiring together, is great. I love it. You love it. We all love it. That's why we're here. It's what brings us together into a community of scholars. But it's perfectly reasonable for us to want to have a hand in shaping the conditions under which we have our discussions. And that's where deliberation comes in. Public deliberation is a decision-making process. Mere discussion of the kind you have in a seminar room is not. In deliberation, we speak with each other, not merely for the sake of discovering what's true, and not merely for the sake of learning something, but specifically for the sake of action. Now, the action about which a group of people deliberate may or may not be more speech. For example, they could deliberate about whether to make a public statement, and if so, what they should say. But people might also deliberate in deciding how to organize their interactions with each other, say, on a campus. The important point is simply that if it isn't aimed at doing something, it's not deliberation. The governing institutions at the University of Chicago do not afford us any meaningful public deliberation. According to the statutes, the Council of the Senate is the supreme academic body of the university. Now, before I say anything about the council, let me just say that the council excludes all non-tenure track faculty, all students, and staff. There is no institution at this university that even pretends to include these members of our community in deliberation. The council pretends to include faculty in deliberation, but in fact, the Council of the Senate is not a deliberative body. I've been on the council for 4 years. I've been on the committee of the council for 2 years, and I was the elected spokesperson of the committee of the council. And on the basis of this experience, I will share with you my view that the primary function of the council is to produce the false appearance that faculty have any meaningful role whatsoever in making decisions at this institution. I think the Council of the Senate is a sham. And in saying this, I'm not comparing our council to some utopian ideal. I am measuring it by the low bar of democracy set by our peer institutions. At the University of Chicago, faculty lack the normal, run-of-the-mill powers of any university senate. For example, we do not have the power to investigate or to censure the president or the provost. There is no provision in the statutes that would allow us to call for a vote of no confidence. We don't have the power to examine university finances, no matter how badly they are mismanaged. We don't have the power to constitute a committee for any purpose. We don't have the power to draft or vote on a resolution about anything. We don't even have the power to put an item on the agenda of our own meetings. We only have 2 powers. We have, most importantly, the power to approve the minutes of the previous council meeting. That's normally the only thing we vote on. Occasionally, we also approve the introduction of a new academic program. Those are the only 2 things we ever vote on, and the votes are always unanimous. There is no deliberation in the council. It is not a deliberative body. The abject powerlessness of our faculty, staff, and students, as dictated by the statutes of this institution, is an expression of the values articulated by the Kalven Report and by the Stone Report on Free Expression. The most quoted line of the Kalven Report is one that draws a contrast between 2 possible speakers, an individual and the institution. Quote, "The instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or the individual student. The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. It is, to get back once again to the classic phrase, a community of scholars." The central opposition between an individual and the institution appears twice in the Kalven Report and then a 3rd time in the Stone Report. It might seem innocent, but in fact, it is a false and sinister dichotomy. Why should the instrument of dissent and criticism be either the individual or the institution? those are not, after all, the only two possibilities. Why shouldn't the instrument of dissent and criticism be, instead of the individual faculty member, the collective faculty? And instead of the individual student, the student body? This is not a radical idea. It is a basic principle of democratic governance. The Kalven Report and the Stone Report erase this possibility. Their vision of a community of scholars is profoundly undemocratic. When we are denied a meaningful role in public deliberation, protest is our only means of shaping the community to which we belong. Protest is essentially disruptive. If it's not disruptive, it's not a protest, it's a conversation. While not all protests are equally disruptive, all aim to disrupt normal life, at least to some extent. They stop us in our tracks and they say, something grave is happening right now, and we can't just go on like nothing's happening. The phrase disruptive protest is pleonastic. A consistent ban on disruptive protest is a ban on protest tout court. A defensible articulation of university values needs to take into account of the fact that disruption is an indispensable part of social and institutional change. The civil rights movement was not a conversation. It was not a free exchange of ideas. It disrupted all of the institutions of the society, including universities, and thankfully so. On this campus in 1962, within the living memory of some people in this room, faculty housing was still racially segregated. Students working with the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, including a young Bernie Sanders, picketed outside the administration building, and then 33 of them occupied the hallway outside the office of the university president, George Beadle. Their occupation continued in a modified form for a week, by which point it was national news. In its negotiations with the students, the administration agreed to end racial discrimination in the rental of university-owned apartments. Retrospectively, one can see that the protesters, the agents of disruption, were the ones who were speaking rationally. Disruption was necessary for the dignity of the students and the faculty, but it was also necessary for the well-being of the institution. The University of Chicago owes those protesters a debt of gratitude. And there is no way to acknowledge such a debt except by incorporating a certain tolerance of disruption into one's understanding of what is acceptable behavior. What is easy for us to see when we look back at the anti-war protesters of the 60s and at the anti-apartheid protesters of the 80s is more difficult to see when we look out the window at the anti-genocide protesters who are camping on the Quad today. But of course, now is the time when we need to be able to see it. I want to conclude by returning to the question I raised at the beginning: what is it about the University of Chicago that makes it the darling institution of the right? The answer I've suggested is that the Chicago principles articulate a conception of the university that is uniquely hostile to basic democratic values like public deliberation and public protest. A broader and better conception of university values would recognize deliberation and protest as fundamental forms of rational public speech.
Thank you for both sharing your thoughts. I made a joke before we got up here that I was going to be the non-philosopher, the social worker, and I'll just put it where the goats can get it. So I will attempt to do that. But I do want to thank both of my colleagues because I think there's going to be a lot of synergy in what I'm going to say here, even if I'm speaking in social work speak. Right outside our door here, we are being tested in our values. And I just want to stop for a second to acknowledge that irony of what are our values. So when Cathy asked if I would do this, of course, when Cathy asks, you say yes, you don't. And so I realized I had said yes, and I didn't really even know what I had said yes to. So I was frantically, moments before this, not literally moments, but like weeks maybe, let's say. Before this, I said, well, what were you supposed to talk about? It's like values in the universe. I love this. I'm a social worker. We're a value-driven profession, right? But I thought, maybe it would be helpful, even though I've been here for 21 years, to sort of look and think, what are the values? I think I have a really good sense of what our implicit values are at this university, so I could ramble on and on about that. But I thought, do we have like an official thing on our webpage about what our values are? So I Googled, and of course, Mr. Miss Google answered me, and sure enough, on the first page, if any of you have seen this, on the first page of our University of Chicago webpage, there is this big drop-down menu that says, who we are. I thought, wow. Raise your hand if you were ever asked to participate in identifying and outlining who we are. Anybody? Faculty Senate, we've both been on it. You ever? No? So who's the we? And who are we? So with incredible curiosity, I clicked on this thing. I was like, I want to know, like, what do we believe? So I went down, and I'll just share some of this with you. None of it will come as a surprise. What did surprise me is the number one was diversity and inclusion. I thought, well, now isn't this interesting? Let me read more. So it goes on about diversity of people and thoughts and ideas. Yes, 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 yes. And I found a really interesting statement that said, and this is important because it's paired with challenging old ways of thinking. I have colleagues that come to mind there, but we'll move on. Number 2, supporting our community in Chicago and beyond. Interesting, our community. While our outreach efforts span the globe, we place a distinct emphasis on supporting our neighbors on the south side of Chicago. We do this by leveraging our financial resources as well as the power of education, research, and innovation to promote meaningful change. Let's say that again, to promote meaningful change. So just put a pin in that. And then, of course, as everyone's talked about, free and open discourse. I'm not going to talk about that. We kind of know where that one goes. Anton, I think, did a beautiful job of laying that out. But I would argue that these values are completely empty and only for show, especially the first one, if they're not accompanied by other values more fundamental and foundational to how we work, how we engage one another, how we see one another, how we show up for one another, how we silence one another, how we engage the use of power and privilege of this elite university to be of service in our leadership and partnership, not just as an elitist or paternalistic presence, but as a true partner. So in my opening remarks, I'm going to suggest that we need to express other value claims to actually get to where we think we want to be. That there are a dangerous assumption that we all know what we're talking about when we say diversity and inclusion, that it's ironic to me that we don't anymore say equity, because then what's it for? Right? I don't want to be here and then be oppressed daily and unequal, right? So like, where are we going with all of this? So the rise of corporatization has brought, I think, with it a set of oftentimes implicit values that I think do us a great disservice, even as some believe it is the only way to balance our current budget problem, a problem that probably none of us in this room created. The corporate mindset and value prioritizes profit over people, personal brand as commodity, efficiency and expedience over process and quality, and conformity and rigidity over plurality and flexibility. We're experiencing this as our own unit faces budget cuts for deficits that many of us, as I stated earlier, have not created, but for which all of us will pay. One of the most troubling aspects of this moment, in my own opinion, is really not the financial or the economic crisis, but how we move through this process together, the decisions that we make, how we work and show up with one another in this moment of crisis. And that we need to put front and center perhaps an alternative set of values that we will most certainly, if we don't, fall short of this university's own lofty goals of transformative ideas and innovative change, to instead perpetuate systems of privilege and exclusion, undoubtedly further marginalizing the very people who are well positioned to help the university realize its goals of innovation, diversity of thought, and the courage to truly practice free inquiry, something I would say I've had yet to witness on this campus. Or practice. How do we help the university realize its goals of innovation and diversity of thought and the courage to truly practice that free inquiry of the full kaleidoscope of ideas possible? I really loved this idea of, inviting people in, the freedom to wonder. I never hear these things when we talk about freedom of expression, so I hope we get to talk about that a little bit more. And ironically, as I think Anton suggested, or maybe not so ironically, those with the most power are now expressing a feeling of unsafeness, that they themselves feel marginalized, that their safety is at risk, even as they seek to smother out the voices of those who continue to be disempowered and silenced, and whose safety to even participate in free speech just outside our window is not so free. To address these challenges, I'm going to suggest that we need to acknowledge and name the values that actually do drive the corporate university, see them, name them, call them out when they exist in our departments and our engagements. And also take risks for creativity, for true equity, for diversity, and to pursue meaningful change. To recognize that diversity is not just a buzzword, or it shouldn't be, but a fundamental value that enriches our educational institutions and society as a whole. But it requires these institutions and many of the people within them to change, like real change. Today I ask myself, is that even possible? And I don't know. I don't know. What values would we need to get there? So I'm going to end with just listing a couple of values that come to my mind in these recent years, and particularly in these last few days. The first is, what would happen if we practiced integrity? What would happen if our leadership and our administrators had practiced integrity with word and deed? If we truly practiced what we preached? If we really showed up in the ways that we said we were going to? What if we had a commitment to truth-seeking, not this single truth or, one single, may the best idea win, Darwinistic kind of sick, toxic ways of engaging knowledge work, but the sharing of always imperfect and culturally situated knowledge with each other, this inviting into a dialogue, into knowledge work. What happened if we defined the value of knowledge work and its success as creating knowledge and innovation, not just for fun, not just to satiate our human curiosities of the other, but to work to improve and dismantle structures and institutions and policies and practices and habits and identities and ways of knowing that seek to actually oppress entire groups and eliminate entire groups of people, and to prevent achieving their full capacities for thriving in the world. And then finally, what would happen if we truly engaged the value of social justice? Engaging one another in socially just ways, engaging the research that we conduct in socially just ways, imagining, who does knowledge belong to? Are we really all out there discovering knowledge? Would you discover my radio if you walked into my car and took it? Is it a discovery to you or to me? Right? And then ultimately, this university is always a product of the values of those in power and the values they choose to uphold. And if we want to create a more inclusive and equitable academic community, one that values diversities of thought and people and freedoms, and communities with the surrounding we must examine our true appetite for change. This idea of doing this knowledge work in community, I think, as you talked about, Gabriel, earlier, is that knowledge doesn't just exist somewhere out there. It's made and created and held and remade between people and in a place and in a time. And I would argue it's only through valuing that collective action and commitment of creating some kind of shared value that holds us accountable, that keeps us from eating each other or killing each other, and really valuing the opportunities that come from true growth, that this university can save itself from itself. Thank you.
All right, I am, I don't even know where to where to start. There are so many amazing questions. I did craft a question that I sent to my colleagues, so I'm going to ask that question. But at some point, I'm hoping we can come back to this, for example, the question of, are we laborers? Right? I think we are laborers. Okay.
Hold on.
I think we are laborers, not paid for producing knowledge. That's true. But we are paid for labors. But one of the things I was hoping we would talk about, and Gina, you just kind of gave us a model of what happens if, in fact, we choose to kind of embrace a different set of values as a way of moving through the work of the university, in this case, even thinking about the financial crisis. And I said to colleagues that we're, as Gina just said, there is an encampment not far from here that I think we have to acknowledge and center, right? That we are at a moment when students across the country are employing the strategy of encampment to oppose what they believe to be, and I agree, the genocide of Palestinians, and what they understand to be the university's complicit support for such activity through, at the very least, our financial interests. And I think at the heart of most of the messaging coming from university presidents across the country is some ill-formed but stated commitment to free speech, and this idea that we need to, quote unquote, protect the normal running duties and responsibilities of a university. And I was hoping you all could just think a bit with me, or think with each other, about how an expanded commitment to different types of values, whether it is intellectual community or diversity or public deliberation, right, changes both what university presidents articulate about what is at stake in these protests and how the university should respond to this protest. Part of the idea of a discussion of values is to open up possibilities of response and action, of community that don't get centered when we lead with and end with only free speech and expression. And so how might we think differently if we invoke new values about what's happening on the Quad right now? You all had a day to think about this question. Don't act like you haven't seen this.
Like what?
Yes.
Well, I'll start.
Thank you. Did you
Um,
turn on your mic?
Oh, sorry.
On the top. It's just a little button on the top that you slide.
Now. Okay.
No.
No?
It doesn't amplify. You've got
Oh, okay. Anyway, I'm not sure. I wish I had more to say about this, but first I want to say I love this question because it's a real question. And I think it's a question that shows, like, you can talk about values, but what's the differential effect?
Yes.
And so I love that. This is what I mean by asking, like, a real question. So I guess, I think I disagree with Anton. Well, maybe I don't. I'm not totally sure because I agree that the council is a sham. But I think we have a lot of opportunities for faculty governance, and not as the university as a whole. But anyway, that's another story. I think that because I do see our central activity here as being knowledge-seeking, understanding of the world, sometimes practically applied in the way that Gina was talking about to actually making the world better. Sometimes, as in my neck of the woods, it's not really for that, but I think it's very valuable. I think that is the central kind of, of valuable speech, which is not to say that I think that it's the most valuable speech everywhere. I think in our democracy, it's absolutely vital to have protest, particularly when there's something, people feel that this is just absolutely insupportable, and they want to do something that breaks the sort of normal protest, which I think our university does allow, as I understand it. But I get that. But I don't myself see the university as having a duty to facilitate a kind of protest that that they think might be harmful to a community of knowledge seeking. I really believe that, and I think I might disagree with you all about this. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, you know, toleration is not just about tolerating what another person thinks, even if you find it offensive. It's also about tolerating their way of making the point up to a certain level. And so I think this is just a difficulty that our administration has, and I hope that they will handle it well, of figuring out, you know, where is the limit? I mean, you know, an encampment comes in and occupies space that belongs to us all. And, you know, what's the limit at which, you know, you're going to tolerate that? As, yes, I see that you all feel the need to do that, but at a certain point, maybe we think we're going to draw the line. So that's all I have to say. And I think that not because I think of it in the United States, but because I think of it in the university as we have different goals.
You know, I think a central part of the messaging that we've gotten from our leadership as recently as yesterday, and specifically in response to this encampment, is that it's very important to remain neutral as an institution. And I think this is another aspect of, another export of the University of Chicago. So I think it's worth thinking critically about the idea of institutional neutrality in this particular moment. And I think it really becomes an issue in the context of the absence of any actual deliberation about what we're going to do. If we could decide things, I think the university wouldn't, the issue wouldn't come up. So just to give you another example, you know, our institution has a long history of opposing the unionization of its graduate students. But recently, as we all know, the graduate students organized a union, voted for a union for the second time in 10 years. And this time, the university is going along with it. They're recognizing the results of a fair democratic process. Nobody thinks that all of a sudden this is a pro-union university.
Right.
By recognizing the results of a fair democratic process, the institution is not making a political statement. It's not taking a political position. Everybody knows that its position is different from the position that prevailed in the fair democratic process. It's very simple to maintain institutional neutrality if you have any democratic process in place. And so, I mean, when the university says on Friday, they said, oh, we can't even discuss divestment because that would compromise our institutional neutrality. But if institutional neutrality is the problem, then the solution is let us vote. Just like commit to administering a fair democratic process by which we decide whether to open and consider our investments, and commit in advance to abiding by the results of that fair democratic process. And then everyone will know that whatever we do, it does not reflect the values of the university. No one's speech will be stifled, no one's research will be messed up. Problem solved.
Poor Gina.
No.
I saw your eyebrows. Like, wait a minute.
Go ahead. Let her respond,
Yes,
and then I'll come in.
And then I'm going to make sure we get
Well,
to Gina.
I mean, yeah, so I guess this is not a democratic institution.
That's
I don't,
what I'm saying.
but yeah, but why? I mean, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, it's, you know, it's inflected with you know, democratic culture, and I think that's good. But it isn't. I mean, and that's, you know, we've got, so there needs to be I think the council is a real problem and should be improved. But, so there should be some mode for faculty decision-making. But faculty do have input in a lot of different ways. Now, the question is is there going to be just majority rule on every single issue? Are we going to have majority rule about what kinds of protests to allow and all that? This is exactly what I'm saying, is that part of, are you going to have a space in which the minority feels capable of expressing and being supported in expressing their minority viewpoint? And I think that is what the goal of institutional neutrality should be aiming for. I take your point about the union, but there were,
But are you suggesting that democratic decision-making stifles the speech of the minority, of the people who lose the vote?
I think that the outcomes of it can have influences that create a stifling atmosphere. I think that is true. But I guess going back, I also just don't think this is not a democratic institution, and I don't think that is an indictment of it myself.
So I want to make sure, Gina, you have a chance to go. But I do think this, in part, is what we were trying, in fact, to facilitate, right? To have a discussion about what are the other values besides free speech. Is it a commitment to being a democratic institution, to democracy, right? We haven't had that discussion about what are the other things that shape and drive, independent of an administration and a person, what we stand for and how we make decisions. And so I just appreciate
the dialogue.
back and
Absolutely.
forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Gina,
And I'll just kind of wedge myself in between these two and say, I agree, this isn't a democratic institution at all. I would have not necessarily a problem with it if we didn't have our own kind of apartheid situation happening in terms of leadership. So I think, to me, when I think about, no one's neutral. I wish we would just kind of start from there. I don't feel like we can have a genuine conversation about any of this without sort of acknowledging that neutrality as a human being position is unattainable. So, what I want from my administration is to be fair and balanced and to listen to all perspectives and make a responsible short and long-term decision that's in the best interest of our community and the institution, and balance out all the things that are tensions and all of that. And I think, I don't know that I trust either way to get, given the current configuration, I do not trust that our trustees represent me at all, my interests, anything. I don't believe that the decision-making then that happens represents even a minority or a majority of faculty, because I believe that it represents the value of money. And so in that, I think we all lose on some level, and all our voices aren't heard. So, what would happen if we would try a more democratic process with at least the areas that we do have democratic structures in place? Let's try that, just to even see. And so I hear your point, and I would say I don't know that we have a healthy functioning unit, whatever we might call it, where I do think there's a minority voice that is the dominant, and it's harming other minority voices on this campus, and also majority voices, whoever those may be and whatever those may be. And so I think, what would we value? I guess I would say to take off always that we prioritize the financial virility of this institution as the only driver of decision making at all cost. At all costs. I just think that's toxic and harmful and deeply destructive to anything that probably all of us would want a university to be.
Gina, I agree with you. I think I agree with you completely about that.
Speak louder for people.
I agree. I think I agree completely about that it's not about the forms, it's about the kinds of listening and who gets in there. We do elect committees that make recommendations about our deans, for instance. But then
they
you
don't, though.
But
they
don't.
Don't.
Well, okay.
I'm on Team Anton about this. This is just totally the show of because we don't choose. Our faculty don't choose the deans. The provost does. And we don't choose the provost. The trustees choose them. It's totally true. I've been on all these things.
We don't choose the president.
We don't choose the president. The trustees do.
You mean in terms of the sort of formal selection? But we
the whole process.
There is a faculty advisory committee, emphasis
Advisory.
That's true.
They have
In my-
they have
okay.
no power in terms of choosing. I mean, they can
Zero.
recommend, they can cajole, but they have
Yeah.
no power when it comes, in fact, to choosing.
And can be undermined in what their
yeah.
choices are.
No, that's right. We don't have that kind of say on the provost, which I think is actually a really big deal.
A big deal.
That's,
Yeah,
I think,
it's a
is
big
a very
deal.
big deal. There is a faculty committee with the president, but also the trustees, and they're deciding. I don't know, my experience with the deans, it's, but maybe it's not always true.
It is not always true.
Yeah.
I know that there have been committees to recommend a dean. They've recommended a dean, and that has been rejected.
Yep.
I know that, we know this, that in fact, even the chair is decided by the dean and not the faculty.
Mhm.
We know that when faculty vote on tenure, that's advisory. It can be rejected by the provost. So the fallacy, if we're talking about power, the fallacy of power
it's a
of the
fallacy.
faculty. But that is not to suggest that the faculty don't have much more power than staff and
Right,
students.
right. It's all the hierarchy.
Professors
And
instructional
instructional professors,
Yes,
right?
yes,
We can
exactly.
go down the hierarchy of
There
who
is a
doesn't have
hierarchy.
power at the university. But I don't want us to lose the focus on values.
Yeah.
So maybe that is the value,
Yeah.
no one has power except for
Yeah.
You had a question.
Wow.
Well, I'm thinking that maybe we open it up.
Mhm,
and
yeah,
then,
to people.
If there are not enough questions, I'll come in. I have so many questions. It's such a rich conversation. There's a lot of interesting disagreement, including what a democratic institution might
Even
look
is,
like.
yeah. Yeah.
We'll get to that hopefully in the context of having some audience participation too.
So we're gonna ask people to please wait for the mic.
Yes, that's true.
Here we are.
How about Dara, Raymond, and then in the back, and Matt there, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that, and then 5.
So thank you all for those wonderful remarks. Gabriel, I'm very taken with the account of the values of the university, the search after truth, but of course the search after truth doesn't end when we leave the quads at Chicago. It also goes on at other universities. And I just wondered to what extent each of you thinks that we have an obligation as a university that cares about the pursuit of truth to defend that pursuit of truth at other universities, and indeed to defend the integrity of academic institutions, whether they're in Florida or in Gaza or wherever we find that they're under attack. And I say that in part because it seems to me that our colleagues at Columbia, students and faculty, have done more, and indeed even administrators, have done more in the last 2 weeks to reveal the flaws of the corporate university than anyone has done in decades, irrespective of what you think about the political project or the encampment. And I wonder whether or not we don't have a responsibility also, whether as faculty or as an institution, to take that little piece of the Kalven Report that says we can speak as an institution to defend our mission and see that mission in slightly broader terms than we have done up to now.
Who are you directing?
Yeah, to Gabriel. Anybody?
Yes. In terms of, we're a private institution, and we don't face the same pressures as public institutions. And I do think we have a responsibility, to stand up and speak and complain and explain to some of our politicians about why their attempt to censor is a bad idea.
Yeah, I guess my only thought to that, I agree with limits. I just sort of worry that, we haven't figured out our own capacity to practice this. And so I get a little worried about going out and doing anything that might be seen as proselytizing. So I think it's important for us to both be working as our own community about how do we practice this here and speak out against the rights and capacities for others to be able to access information and wrestle with it fully in the full scope of information. I think that's important, and that's an imperative. So I don't think it's important, you know, I don't believe in just be like, just, you know, pay attention to your own little backyard. But I also want to caveat that with, I'm wildly disappointed in our own capacity and courage to practice that with each other.
Anton, did you want to
Well, I mean, you know, I feel like when it comes to the Chicago principles, we're evangelicals. I
Yes.
mean, we're out there
Totally.
spreading the good news. We put it on our, you know, we put it on our webpage. How many people adopt them? I
Yes,
mean, we
we
brag
brag
about
about it,
So
yeah.
it's not. There's no option of
Yeah.
like us just not like just like focusing on our own
Christian
house.
faith.
That's not happening.
Yeah.
So then it's weird. So okay. Now is there's like these crazy hearings in Congress. Now would be a great time to
Go out there.
step up. And,
where are
you know,
we?
hoping nobody will notice. I don't know. I mean, like
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
So it looks a little opportunistic, frankly, you know, and it's hard to avoid the appearance that, oh, you know, this is clearly the central piece of our brand. But when it's the time,
To speak out for it. Where are
it's,
we?
you know, hiding under the table or something, hoping that nobody
Calls us for it.
sends you an email.
That's true.
Hello, is this on? Yes, it's on. Yay. Hello, Ramon, Political Science. I'm short, so I should stand up. So I have a very specific question, which is, you know, we keep talking about values and actors and processes, but as I was at the encampment yesterday and today, the actor that I think students are most worried about right now is campus police, right?
Yeah.
And I am a bit worried about the obfuscation of, well, when is enough enough? And what does enough mean? Because what I hear there is the threat of force and coercion, which can certainly be weaponized for majority rule. So I want to be careful there. But so I want to hear, because if I were to say, well, I don't know, measure by budget, our values, I would see that one of our big values seems to be policing. So what is the role of policing in the university? And by policing, I don't mean discourse policing, I mean batons.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, well, I would say underneath that is policing, but it's also like who has the privilege and right to whose safety. I would pair it with that too, you know, that it's this ongoing dialogue about, so I'm on the, what's called Public Safety Commission Council as part of my role at the Race Center. I'm not a voting member, which I find interesting, but I attend. And, you know, kind of like faculty senate, right? I'm familiar with this role, so I show up. But I do find it, you know, like we've had this is not a new conversation around policing, to be sure, here, you know? And I don't know, I don't have a lot to say that's good about this, other than I do think that we're very obsessed here at this school with safety. When things have happened, a certain group's safety is always evoked. A group is always prioritized about their fear and worry, you know? And so we have now more things that we're being told at Faculty Senate. We're gonna get cameras and we're gonna get all this stuff and extra policing in real time. And now we're partnering not just with our police, but our police partner with city police. And we are gonna talk together and be on top of stuff, yes. And I had speaking of, we both, Anton and I love talking about Faculty Senate, but one of my Faculty Senate, when I said, for whose safety is this? Because more police does not mean I'm more safe. I don't feel more safe. And they're like, what do you mean? Don't you feel, Gina, more safe if they have cameras on them? I was like, no, then like everybody else, you'd be watching me get the shit beat out of on TV, and you'll just have a video of it. No, it doesn't make me feel more safe. So to me, this idea of policing and control, we could talk about it as surveillance and all this other stuff, but I also feel it gets at this other issue of power at our university of who gets to say who's unsafe. You know, I've been brought into all kinds of meetings just because one white guy on this campus decides that he doesn't like something that we've said or doesn't like something, you know? So I just feel there's such incredible imbalance in our school around who can wield the institution. And there are some times when faculty have huge power, some faculty, and others do not at all have power. And I think it goes alongside also the police of who can wield the police for whose benefit and for whose right and for whose safety and for whose perspective and for whose protection and for whose service. And they, I would say, don't necessarily serve us all. I guess that's all I'll say about that.
And just to add something to that, at this moment, as many colleagues at places like Columbia have pointed out, the weaponization of safety as a way of tamping down protest,
Yes.
managing dissent is
Yeah.
Really at an all-time high, it seems, at least a 21st century high.
I mean, there's also the weaponization of safety for a very long time on this campus to say, we will keep college students and faculty and those who we recognize
As one of
part
us.
this community safe, and it's largely thought to be safe from the surrounding community.
Yes.
So surrounding communities
Yes.
do not feel safe walking on this campus, right? So it's whose safety, what do we
From
mean by
who?
safety, how a university that is
Yes.
about ideas and innovation can't be invested in reimagining safety. And instead, we've invested money in making, in fact, carceral logics and practices in police more efficient, not,
Right,
not less.
More
present.
humanistic.
I think that's this issue of people feeling welcome and able to come into our space is really important. I agree about that. I will just say about the weaponization of safety. I get what you're talking about, Lisa, but I think that we should realize that there are students who feel afraid. The one time I had a real sort of issue of thinking about how, as chairs we're not supposed to be making public statements and stuff was about the graduate student who was murdered. And there I had students who wanted me to circulate petitions about public safety. That was coming from bottom up. And it really was. So I had this thought, well, should I look like I'm endorsing it? But I don't think we should pretend that it's just people in power who are the ones who are invoking safety and the ones who aren't. I don't think that fits the reality
No,
totally.
I agree, and by
Yeah.
my suggestion, and I think colleagues at Columbia too, are not just saying that it's people, with ostensible, say, administrative power, are the only ones who are weaponizing safety. In fact, there are a number of contributors to the certain climate now that we're seeing across universities where, and that's part of what's so problematic and befuddling or challenging about this moment, is that, yes, there's an administrative line about this, but there are also individuals who are weaponizing safety as well, and appealing to the kinds of procedural norms that are currently in place, taking advantage of them. Which is not what you're talking about either, but I'm saying more abstract or more generally, I grant you that it's not simply people in power that can use this.
Yeah, because speech can be offensive and it's scary to listen to it.
Yes.
And that's part of what we are officially committed to allowing.
I think though, as we talk about that, because I agree with that, but I also witnessed during that time sometimes people racializing and being racist about their fear. And so I think there's got to be a balance around yes, if you feel afraid, the social worker in me is how you feel is valid. And you can't, when somebody feels afraid, you can't sit and rationalize with them there's no danger. If you're afraid, you're afraid. And though, the solution to that isn't indulging in someone's fear when it is actually irrational, but helping them work through it. And so I feel like there's a lot of indulging of racist and classist fear You know, the fact that I had some students that I walked by who were getting Ubers paid for by our university from Crown to Harris, which is a block away, and we were paying for that. And I'm like, that's an irrational, racist fear. And I recognize that that student might need therapy, like might need help. I'm not discrediting that fear as real, but I also challenge us to think through, how are we helping our students live in a society and in a campus where they are terrified to go where I live, or to where my office is, or to where I get gas, just because there's people who look like me. And I think that is what I worry about, how we do that. How do we, and that's difficult and delicate, but it can be done. It can be done. And I worry about how we on the South Side are very bad stewards of being, helping students work through fears that they experience for things that really do happen, when the statistics are that, Cathy, Anton, and I are more at risk for getting shot than my white students are. And we still have to show up and live our lives. And so how do we help as a university? How do we help all of our members be here in a way that is socially just and work through these feelings that people have? And I'm disappointed by the way that we continue to always choose to do that, I think.
There was a question at the back, yeah?
Thank you. Hi, thank you all for your comments, all very interesting. Some of you briefly mentioned that diversity and inclusion is necessary for the continuance of discovery, knowledge, and development. I was wondering if anyone could answer this. The success of current policy in admissions for diversity and inclusion, if that's been helping the development of knowledge, and if not, what's the alternative for it? And as a complementary question, what is the goal of diversity and inclusion? Is it to have an equal representation of opinions, or what is the goal for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, yes and no. Has policy been successful? Like affirmative action policy actually helped white women more statistically. That's the biggest change that we've seen. I think implicit in this understanding of pairing diversity with people with diversity of thought is a little tricky, because I would argue there could be, sameness in so-called race experience or culture experience and diversity of thought within a group. So I think it's far bigger of an issue, than that. If I would think about, I would argue all of our fields, and there's quite a lot of research actually in the business community that shows that when businesses become more specifically racially diverse, they are more profitable. So I think there is all kinds of research that suggests that diversity in the bodies we're in, because we live in a society that then treats us differently because of the bodies we're in, be it by gender, race, class, caste, sexuality, religion, all these different ways that we mark people and position people, that causes us to have different experiences, to see different parts of the world, and that then when we study, because I go back and I say, neutrality is I would argue, a lie, that subjective experience maps onto how we do our work, how we philosophize, what we bring to that, what the questions we ask, what we argue is significant, how we write, what we want to do with our time, and then how you learn, what you hear, what's new to you, what's not new to me. All of that comes from the bodies we're in and how we move through the world where we grew up, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, there's all kinds of evidence that does a difference. But I think, unfortunately, I would argue, in my opinion, too often we reduce it down to we just need to sprinkle in difference. And there's no magic there. There's no magic. Like all of us have lived in a gendered world, and that hasn't undone sexism. It hasn't undone sexual harassment. It hasn't undone, So just being in proximity with another person doesn't magically, I come from a mixed race family. There's racists in my family. There's no magic there, that happens. It takes something else, something more than just diversity to get to this place where it really changes then how we think, how we do with one another, how we feel one another, whether we really see each other. I think That's what I'm trying to get at with these other values of it. If we really want to get the best of what diversity has to give us, we've got to have other values that allow us to feel one another and experience one another in a real way. And I would argue that, I would even go as far as saying, I think in particular, people with privilege and power are disadvantaged in doing that. That's something that those of us who come from any kind of marginalized identity have to do for our survival. And I think in order for us to really take advantage of diversity, people who have not had to live in that context, white people, cisgender males, heterosexual males, et cetera, Christians, any of these sort of identities, are the people who really have to do some pretty major changing. And I'm asking us to consider, like, how is that, different values, like really different, radically different values of what we center, what we think is normal and average, and who's the comparison, and all of that kind of stuff. And it's I think that's a lot to ask.
I know I'm a broken record on this one, which is, I think it's fine to think about kind of diversity and inclusion, but without thinking about kind of questions of power.
Power and structure, it just doesn't.
But yeah, power and structure. Gina and I have had this conversation how many times. So it is fine to think about, are we diversifying, whatever that means, the student body. But my question is, we think about the locations of real power and decision-making in the university. Have we diversified the board?
Mm-hmm.
Have we diversified who holds the presidency? Are the provosts diverse? Are the deans diverse? And I would suggest a resounding no to that question. Now, I don't believe that just diversity, racial diversity, for example,
There's no
and
magic
surely
there.
not gender diversity, moves a university and changes the policies. It is one small way in which we can begin to kind of measure that. But I think we always have to put in the center of these discussions power, power, power. Who really gets to make decisions? Who shifts a university? Who makes decisions about how we will interact with the surrounding communities, right? And so I appreciate the focus on diversity and inclusion, but without equity and power, I don't think
It doesn't
it's
mean
very
anything.
much.
Could I include socioeconomic or economic?
Absolutely.
I
Yes.
think that's a crucial one.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And maybe religious.
I want to ask a more technical question. Maybe it's not too technical. I, like everybody else here, I think, got President Ali Vasatos's email on the encampment yesterday. And I lead a seminar with a Little Red Schoolhouse. And it was a superb piece of writing. I'll give it that much. But I want to speak to what the differences might be between I think fact recognition and truth seeking, because there were some incredible distortions in that email, primarily about the sit-in. It was actually stated specifically that sit-in was disrupting university operations while the building was closed, that there was no one else in the building. And I sat there and I went, so is that what institutional neutrality looks like?
Yes.
Flagrant lying by omission? So my question, forgive me for queuing up in this way. What is that difference between fact recognition and truth seeking, and what is the university's responsibility to either or both as an actor that does literally get to state which protest is okay and which is not, as we saw in yesterday's email?
Last comments?
Yeah, last comments for anybody
answer
who
this
can
and
pick
last
this up, and
comments.
anything else you want to say. And we do have a reception at VCT in Foster, in the lounge, so please join us there for more informal conversation. But first of all,
Yeah.
Wouldn't
Well-
they deny that that was the fact? I mean, I think that just goes to show is that what counts as a fact is itself that's a disputed issue.
Yeah, you know, when you asked that question, just be honest. The first thing that came to my mind was all of the work that we did over the pandemic, et cetera, around more than diversity when the faculty went on strike. And one of the things that we asked for was a truth commission that would be partnered, the community and university, to sort of really look at what kind of actor have we been on the South Side. And there were months and months where, I kid you not, we actually debated about whether or not we could even use the word truth. And the title, now that it is, will tell you who won that. It is now, oh geez, what is it called? The U Chicago Community Relations, Past, Present, Future. Because if we even say the word truth, it would, I was told, this is why we don't want to use the word truth, is it would be an admission that we had done something wrong. So I would argue that, what is that expression, the story of the hunt, when told by the lion, will always valorize and glorify the hunter, And so that's one of the privileges of those in power, is to narrate, to choose what facts matter, to position them in a story. And that I think what you're seeing is that play out, it's like who gets to, I do think there are a set of facts that are omitted in that, and that's one thing. But there's also then the other aspect of, do we really value this integrity? Do we do things with integrity? And do we tell stories with integrity even when it makes our position not look so glossy? Because we value another thing called the multiplicity or the kaleidoscopic understanding of a truth. And today I'd say no. Based on that email, I'd say no, we don't. We value something else, like our comfort, our image, our safe, I'm not including myself in that, but the institutional protection of a version of identity, or truth or something, right? I don't know, Anton, you going to finish?
No, I'm not touching this one. That was, no, I think that's more eloquent than I could have said.
Last comments.
Final comments. Well, I guess I do think, and this is a point that Gina made that I thought about in preparing for this, that it's just hard to think, it's complicated to think about the values of the university because, in ways that have to do with the fact that it's an institution. And so every institution, whether it's a for-profit or a non-for-profit institution, has values, and you can just look it up on the webpage and see what their values are. And there's obviously a difference between what an institution professes its values to be and what its real values are. That's one difference. And then there's another difference, which is the difference between the values of the institution, whether real or professed, and the values of the people who constitute that. And as you pointed out, it's whether we're talking about a for-profit or a non-for-profit institution, I mean, the relation between the values of the institution and the values of the people who make it up are not. It's not straightforward. And normally the people aren't. Well, put it this way: if people aren't asked their values, then these statements of values, no matter what committee is convened to do it, they just don't. They're not expressions of the values of the people who are part of it. That they can't be. And so, I don't know. I just think that's I don't think that if we. I guess my parting thought is, I don't wish that the university would constitute another committee in the same way it constituted the Freedom of Expression Committee, and charge that committee with coming up with more values. I don't think that would represent my values anymore, because it has to do, because think about, when I don't look, why don't the Chicago principles represent our values? I think they don't. Nobody ever asked us. Nobody said, what do you think? Never. And so even if they correspond, they could be identical in content to your values.
It's not the content, right? It's the process, it sounds like.
Yeah, but
you keep saying no one ever, you could imagine a democratic process where in fact there were opportunities
Oh, you could.
for the community, the
You
intellectual
could.
community.
Can I
to-
make-
to- you I know everyone disagrees with me.
No, I think a suggestion, yes, okay, good. 'Cause you're in
Use
charge.
that power,
You're in
Kathy.
charge. No, I have a suggestion about this.
Yes.
I mean, because I think for some of these committees and reports, they actually, I remember like getting emails, like if you want to weigh in, and of course I never did. What I think is so great about this series is that what you first have to have is meetings where people come together sort of informally and they're talking. And, you know, I love, Gina, this idea of integrity. The example you're talking about, I think is pretty bad. You know, so there does need to be integrity, but we also have to realize that people are not going to agree at the end of the day about truth, and at a certain point we have to trust the good faith of people. How do we build trust in the good faith of our community? I think it's by having meetings like these where we're talking, and I wish the council was more like that, the committee of the council. I mean, I was the spokesperson and banged my head against trying to get anything on the agenda. But once you have that, then you could have a committee like yours. It's still not gonna, it's not necessarily gonna speak for everybody, but it might actually, if people are of goodwill, and I actually, basically, I love my colleagues. I think they're good people, and I think if they had more of a sense and more discussion, a committee like you're talking about, Kathy, might actually have a more substantive result at the end of the day.
I can sort of accept that. As part of a process, moving us, I just think there has to be some articulation of, I don't dare say, oppositional values to the thing that we often hear, which is only about free speech, freedom of expression. Because even the discussion that we had just a moment ago about safety, right? Should safety be a central value that structures the work of the university? The safety of our students in the classroom. I believe that if students are safe, and we can decide what safe means, they are more willing to be uncomfortable when confronting new ideas, right? So how do we balance that? And I just think that there's an opportunity for us as a community, and I don't think it stops with, so this is a lovely room, but it doesn't represent the university that I know. You're all wonderful people, but it is not a diverse community, right? So we have to make real efforts to be, intentional about including a whole series of voices that often get excluded from processes of developing certain types of reports. And I'm not saying let's just have another report. I'm saying what would it mean to truly build a democratic process? There's an inclusive process where people could be heard in a way that we're never heard. We might be heard, but we never have enough power at this institution right now.
And I would just want to add to that in closing that in some ways, Anton, you gave us a version of an answer to how to make the process more democratic by moving beyond discussion to deliberation and an embrace of protest. And on that note, some of you may want to go outside for various reasons, and others of you may want to come join us